Welcome to Motive and Malice. Today, we're diving headfirst into a story that's part true crime, part political thriller. We're talking about one of the most audacious cash heists in history. And trust me, it pulls back the curtain on the dark, complicated world where high-stakes politics and organized crime collide. Let's just start with the number, because it's just staggering. 26.5 million pounds. Let that sink in. At the time, we're not just talking about the biggest cash robbery in Irish history. This was the biggest in British history, period. A jaw-dropping amount of money, all stolen in a single night. So how'd they do it? Well, forget everything you think you know about bank robberies. This was no quick smash and grab. It was a cold, calculated operation. It all kicked off on a Sunday evening, back in December 2004. Imagine this. Masked men force their way into the homes of two senior bank officials. They take their families hostage. Then they deliver the terrifying ultimatum. You will go to work tomorrow as if nothing is wrong, and you will help us empty the vaults, or your loved ones will die. I mean, can you even imagine? So the next day, on Monday, they did exactly as they were told. They walked into the Northern Bank Cash Center in Belfast and started moving millions. And the getaway? Almost laughably simple. They just labeled the bags of cash as rubbish, wheeled them out to a van, and vanished into the night. A heist this clean, this perfectly executed, it immediately raised a huge question for everyone. The police, the public, everyone. Who on earth had the resources, the discipline, and just the sheer nerve to pull something like this off? The robbers' knowledge of the bank was just astonishing. They knew the security protocols, the layouts, everything. This wasn't the work of your average criminals. It had the precision of a military-style operation. It pointed to a group that was highly disciplined, highly sophisticated. So, who could it be? Well, it didn't take long for all signs, from police forces in both Ireland and the UK, to point in one direction: the Provisional IRA. Now, you have to understand why this was such a bombshell. At this point, the IRA had been on an official ceasefire for years. They were a key part of the Good Friday Peace Agreement. This wasn't just a robbery, it was a political earthquake. And the political fallout was immediate and immense. As you can see on screen, the author Glenn Patterson summed it up perfectly. He said, "The leaders of Sinn Féin vehemently denied their involvement, no one believed them," and he was right. The denials came fast, but governments in London, Dublin, and even Washington just weren't buying it. The whole peace process was suddenly thrown into absolute crisis. So that gets us to the really crucial question. Why? Why would a political group that's supposedly on a path to peace pull off a massive crime that could jeopardize everything they'd worked for? Well, to get that, you really have to look at the playbook for how these groups actually operate and fund themselves. And to help us understand, we can actually turn to an academic model you see here on screen. It was developed by two researchers, John Jupe and Matthew Garrod, and it's called the Northern Ireland Terrorism Organized Crime Interaction Model. Now, I know that's a mouthful, and the chart looks a little complicated, but stick with me, because we're going to break down the key parts, and they are fascinating. All right, the first big idea is what they call hybrid organizations. This is where the line between a group's political cause and its criminal business becomes incredibly blurry. They're fighting for a political ideology, yes, but they're also deep into crime for profit. It gets to a point where you really can't tell where one ends and the other begins. Now, one way these hybrid groups work is through something the model calls assimilation. This is where a paramilitary group doesn't just work with criminals. It essentially becomes its own criminal enterprise. They build up all the skills and knowledge in-house to pull off these really sophisticated crimes themselves. And that brings us right back to the heist, doesn't it? A massive, meticulously planned bank robbery like this is usually the work of professional crime syndicates. But here, it was pulled off with military precision by a paramilitary group. It is a textbook, perfect example of assimilation. Okay, so the second method these groups use is alliances. This is pretty much what it sounds like. Instead of doing it all themselves, they form partnerships. They create working relationships with other paramilitary groups, or even with straight-up organized crime gangs, all for mutual benefit. And these aren't just local arrangements. We are talking about major global operations. Research has pointed to some incredible alleged alliances. You've got the PIRA and the 'Ndrangheta, the Italian mafia, in a massive money laundering scheme. The real IRA buying weapons from Balkan arms traffickers. Loyalist groups like the UVF and UDA with links to Chinese triads. It is a truly international network of crime. So this leads to a really critical question, especially in a post-Troubles era. What happens when the political conflict is officially over, but these incredibly powerful, well-structured organizations that were built for that conflict just don't go away? This brings us to another key concept from the research, something called minor transformation. This is what happens when a group declares a ceasefire, they publicly commit to peace, but they don't actually disband. They strategically keep everything, their command structure, their members, their expertise, fully intact. They basically just put the war machine in storage, ready to be fired up again if they choose. Now, what's really interesting, as you can see from this table, is that different factions often specialized in different kinds of crime. The research suggests Republican groups tended to focus on things like smuggling fuel and cigarettes, armed robbery, and fraud. On the other side, Loyalist groups often got more into drug crimes, extortion, and even intellectual property theft. They each kind of carved out their own niche in the criminal economy. And let's be absolutely clear, even with ceasefires in place, the violence didn't just disappear. The numbers here speak for themselves. In the decade between 2008 and 2018, long after the peace agreement was signed, there were still 610 shooting incidents and almost 500 bombing incidents linked to paramilitarism. The threat remained very, very real. And all of this leads to a central, really unsettling question that we're still dealing with. What happens when the political cause, the original motivation, starts to fade away, but the incredibly profitable criminal machine that was built to support it just keeps on running? And here it is. This might be the most shocking fact of this entire story. It is now decades later, and not one single person has ever been convicted for the Northern Bank heist. 26.5 million pounds stolen, and no one ever held accountable. That fact alone speaks volumes about the power these organizations still have. So we've seen how the lines blur, how political movements can transform into these hybrid criminal organizations that are built to survive long after a conflict is over. This leaves us with a final, pretty provocative thought. When the organizations of conflict don't actually disappear, but just shift their focus to becoming criminal empires, what does peace truly mean? I'd love to know what you think. Drop a comment below.